Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week I'll be reviewing Climate Future by Robert Pindyck. I'll talk very briefly about the author, go into an overview of what the book is about, talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I'll be reading for next time. Robert Pindyck is a professor at MIT. He is an economist and has written several books, mostly on the topic of climate, but also on some other topics as well. This book, Climate Future, I would say is a summation of his work on climate. It has a lot of ideas and it's very difficult to summarize. But if I had to sum it up in a few sentences, I'd say Robert Pindyck makes the argument in the book that there is really two reactions to climate. Once you've accepted that climate change is happening and once you accept that it is a bad thing, there is an aversion model or an adaptation model. And there's kind of two different buckets that human beings and governments can do in order to react to climate change. And when I mean climate change, I mean on the global level. These are things that are going to impact every country a little bit differently. But broadly speaking, the aversion would be doing things like reducing the carbon that's going up into the atmosphere, would be like electrifying the grid, so making a change from coal and natural gas powered power grids to renewable grids, switching to renewable automobiles, things of that nature. What we typically would say is aversion. Adaptation would be things like raising seawalls. He has a relatively long chapter on, well, he goes into some detail on geoengineering, which is kind of a radical idea, but also, investing in heat resistant and flood resistant agriculture would be another version of adaptation. So that all is to say that those are the two different reactions that he puts forward in those. That's kind of the big idea in the book, is that for a lot of people who talk about climate, there tends to be a push towards aversion, and he basically says we also need to consider adaptation, and here are the reasons why. And he goes what I consider to be a very good summation of where we are in terms of global carbon, how much carbon we're putting up into the atmosphere, and where we would need to be in order to really reduce the carbon levels to around where the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is kind of the gold standard of climate reports, says we need to be in order to avoid some of the more catastrophic results. The problem is, and he looks at it as an economist, and I think one of the big takeaways is the book is, for everything that we know about climate, there's probably 5 to 10 things that we don't know. And all the climate models are not necessarily inaccurate, but if you run the climate models, they have a lot of unknown unknowns, which is to say there are things that we know that we just don't know. We don't know if the level of GDP is going to continue, if the level of GDP, if it continues in some of these countries, like really the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, if those GDPs continue to rise, will the amount of carbon per GDP also continue to rise, or will that number go up, getting closer to an American style of consumption? So we're talking about automobiles, we're talking about heating, we're talking about things of that nature. The other, I think, big unknown is there's several unknowns, but if there is a tipping point. And the thing that he talks about that I hadn't really thought about in the past is there's a difference between the amount of carbon that we burn in each year that's released into the atmosphere. There's also an amount of carbon that is stored over time, because carbon takes roughly 100 years for it to completely dissipate. The effects of climate are being felt by things that we burned 20, 30, 40 years ago. And so there's an idea that as that amount gathers, it's going to, at some point, if there's a tipping point to where there essentially is no coming back from it, and it will start kind of a cycle to where it's going to exacerbate already pre-existing heat waves and things of that nature. So there's a lot of information in the book. There's a lot of information regarding if that tipping point exists. There's a lot of information regarding what would a 3% rise in temperature mean versus 4% versus 5% versus 6%. And the answer he kind of comes to is we just don't know. And so basically his kind of summary is we don't know about these things. Because we don't know, we have to kind of make some educated guesses. and we have to understand that, if it is a, let's say, 7% increase in temperature by the end of the century, which is usually considered on the more extreme end, even though there's a very small chance of that happening. He basically says, the way to look at this is really to look at it like insurance. Yes, your house is not likely to burn down, but the cost for you to rebuild your home is so high that spending a little bit of money now in order to prevent the worst situation from happening in the scenario from happening in the future is money well spent. And that's another thing that I hadn't really thought of before, but makes a lot of sense. So I think he explains things in a very straightforward manner. Some of this stuff is very, very wonky. I'll get to that in a little bit, but I think the amount of detail that he goes into as far as the what he considers to be kind of the optimistic scenario and where that would leave us in the most optimistic scenario, I thought was really interesting, and I felt it was a very sober look at the limitations, really, of what we can probably likely do in terms of the global change and climate. And that was the other big thing. The big takeaway of the book is, America and Europe can do certain things and actually have been reducing their carbon relative to the population pretty steadily. The question is, will India and will China follow suit? And if not, what are the limits of what we can do? And he has some answers as far as trade deals and trade packages and things like that. He's a big fan of a carbon tax, and he kind of goes into pretty deep detail of why that's the best policy. He also explains why this is such a difficult thing to do cost-benefit analysis of. Kind of like I said before, there's so many kind of known unknowns of things that we just don't know. It's very difficult for them to model. A dollar spent today can't be gotten back if that dollar does not go towards preventing something that would have happened regardless. And so that's a dollar of abatement. So that kind of concept was pretty interesting. He kind of goes into different models showing different scenarios, and I think I've covered everything that I really enjoyed about the book. Like I said before, kind of the sunk cost, the idea of if we spend this dollar today, we can't get back in the future, and if that doesn't prevent damage greater than or equal to that dollar, it's something of a wasted dollar. So that kind of idea. And then finally, there's a reading list for every chapter. So he gives you a ton of different books to read if this is a topic that you're interested in. I was really, really big on this book. I think it's a really, really good kind of 2.0 book. If you're familiar with climate change and you're like, well, where are we? And I want to see what I consider a fair and balanced view and a look at a lot of data, but just to get an understanding of where we are and where we're likely to be and kind of the best way to look at it. I thought it was a really interesting book of kind of pulling these things together. And he goes into, I think, a fair bit of detail on each of his ideas. At times, as far as the cons, I think there are times where it was maybe repetitive. There are times where the language is a little academic and technical. I mean, at one point in the book, there's a formula to show you. He has kind of a bunch of different charts. Some of the charts are easier to read than others, I will say. And there's a part where I remember my geometry training of 1/2 base time height equals the area of a triangle, which is not something I use every day. And so I did have to bust that out. He kind of shows his work. So if you're someone who has kind of higher mathematics skills, you may appreciate those things more than I did. I don't know if this is supposed to be written for a non-technical audience necessarily. I think you can kind of skim some of the quadratic formulas and things of that nature. But it's there if you want to see it. I did think that there was a little bit of repetition. There's a chapter in the book about methane. I think that chapter was important. It goes on for maybe a little bit too long. But to make you understand kind of other than carbon, which adds to climate change, there's also other gases, one of the most important, which is methane, and how methane differs from carbon and why it is maybe not as important as some people may make it out to be in terms of fighting climate change. And then finally, the other thing, he goes into a little bit of a couple of ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere, which is different than ways to prevent additional carbon from being added. One of them is carbon sequestration. The other one is reforestation. He doesn't give a lot of time to reforestation, which I thought was really interesting. I thought that politically, and that would be the other thing that I think maybe I could ding the book for, but the reforestation chapter is relatively short. Carbon sequestration is a little bit of a novel technology, so I don't think we have a ton of good data on it. But the reforestation, I was expecting him to come with more numbers. He says as a tool to fight climate change is important, but he doesn't really go into deep detail of why he classifies it as expensive, but it doesn't go into great detail as why it's expensive. He mentions that we would need a lot of land in order to plant that. I think he says, if you were able to plant 50 billion trees, it would have a relatively large impact as far as removing carbon from the atmosphere and would actually make a difference in kind of the fight, against climate change. But then he says, but it's expensive. It would require a lot of land. And I was just going, well, your federal government has a lot of land and a lot of money, so why couldn't you just tell the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, to plant 1,000 trees on each one of their hectares? It doesn't really follow that line of thought, but I thought that was interesting. If I think he didn't really follow that to its full conclusion as far as the cost of reforestation and how that could be a useful tool. And then finally, the other thing, it is written from an economist perspective, and so he goes a little bit into the politics of some of this stuff, but most of it kind of stays out of the politics in terms of which one of these tools would be more politically feasible than others. And I was a little disappointed by that. I wish there had been something in there to where he kind of at least wrestles with this idea that some of these ideas may be less or more politically viable than others. The reforestation one specifically, I think that there is something of a political consensus of that being more palatable to most people than having, say, $1.50 gasoline tax for every gallon in order to offset the additional cost of carbon per ton of carbon or whatever it is. So I really like this book. And I think that a lot of people who know a little bit about climate would be really well served to read this, because I think it does do a very good job of giving you a sober look at where we are, as well as probably the limits of what we can hope to achieve in the future in terms of not only America, but the rest of the world, and why some of those limitations exist. There's a couple places where I thought he could have given more deference or more possibility to things like the reforestation. I would have liked to have seen reforestation worked in his model a little bit more, as well as the carbon sequestration. He has a model at the beginning of the book, like the first 50 pages, that shows you what I think is probably the most realistic, optimistic scenario, which is that we get to, by 2050, 1990 levels of carbon emissions. But because due to the amount of carbon that's already in the atmosphere and the relative slow rate of what we call dissipation, which is the carbon that is removed from the atmosphere by current means, meaning the trees that we have planted, the ocean is something of a dissipator, showing that, and how even if we had like the most optimistic, realistic scenario, we would still probably be around 2.5, 2.75 degrees Celsius increase by 2100, even if you got to that level by 2050. So it really, you can read that one of two ways. You can read that, we think that means that we need to really push for like 2040 or 2035, and you would need something like a Make America Green or a Green New Deal. My frustration with that model is it doesn't take into account, well, if we were going to put those resources forward, will we not also put resources forward in terms of reforestation or carbon sequestration? So wouldn't the dissipation rate rise a little bit? It doesn't really take that into account, but that's kind of a relatively small issue. As you can tell, I have a lot of thoughts on the book. I think that it was really well done. It is academic at times, but if you accept, the idea of climate change and you're looking for where we are, where we're going, what are some different things to think about this topic, I think it's a really thorough book. For being only 200 pages, it goes through a lot. It's really dense. And I would say maybe don't try to read the whole thing in like a couple days like I did. But for me, it was a lot. It was very much a page turner. And I thought there was a lot of really, really interesting information. At times it's a little bit repetitive, but otherwise I think it was really well written. He shows you his work. If you want to learn even more about the topic, at the end of each chapter, he has some additional readings that I thought was good places to go. So Robert Pindyck, Climate Future, highly recommend it. Next time we'll be reading Netherworld by Joseph O'Neill. Until next time, please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I apologize I was gone. I had a surgery, so I'll try to get back to more of a regular schedule as I recover from that. So until next time, bye.